everyone, welcome. This is Cynthia Denny from Out of the Woods. I am so happy that you have joined us. This is a continuation in our series on Getting Counseling 101. Today, we're going to talk about diagnosis, something that might be a little bit scary for some folks. It's confusing for a lot of folks, including those of us who have the responsibility of actually doing it. So we're going to dig in and talk about what diagnosis is, why you may or may not have diagnosis done automatically as part of the counseling process, a little bit about what you can expect from it, and we're going to try to address some of the concerns about this particular label. And the first thing I'd like to highlight is the fact that it is a label. And labels can be good and bad. We tend to think of them, when we label people, we tend to think of it as a negative type of thing. But I would argue that these labels, if they are appropriately applied, if they are accurate, if they're used like they're supposed to be used, they can be helpful as opposed to dangerous. So that's the first thing I'd like for us to get our head around, is that these labels do exist for a purpose. They are helpful to us, and the big part, or the important part about that, is that they are accurate and that they are done. They're only used in the way that they were intended to be used. And unfortunately, there has been a lot of misuse of diagnosis over the years. It's really been um, it's a problem. It's a problem. And so I get why there is so much both confusion and concern about a diagnosis. So let's dig in. Let's talk a little bit more specifically about what a diagnosis is. I already said it's a label. It's a way of classifying certain sets of symptoms under under an umbrella term, so that the counselor and other people that might be working together on the treatment team have a common way of understanding clusters of symptoms. So, for example, if somebody goes to a psychologist and the psychologist gives a diagnosis, a label, and says, look, I want you to do two things. I want you to go see a psychiatrist to see if medication would be appropriate for you, and I want you to go see a counselor to see if counseling would also be appropriate for you. Well, that psychologist would likely send the client on their way with some type of diagnosis. When the client gets to the psychiatrist and the counselor, the psychiatrist and the counselor are going to be able to look at that diagnosis and know automatically where the psychologist is coming from. They don't have to read the whole report. It's good for them to read the whole report. They don't have to read the whole report to get some idea of what it is that we are going to be addressing. So if the psychologist in this scenario diagnosed someone with bipolar depression or schizophrenia or um, alcohol withdrawal, I would have some idea of where I'm going to get started. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm not going to look into it to make sure that that psychologist did a good job with making the diagnosis. It doesn't mean that that label is permanent. What it does do is keeps me from asking you all of the same questions that the psychologist just asked you a couple of days ago. It helps to narrow down what we're doing. When I get a report from a psychiatrist who maybe has prescribed medication and has given the client a diagnosis, I can better understand what the psychiatrist is thinking when they prescribed a particular medication. For example, um, we'll use a specific medication. Somebody goes to the psychiatrist diagnoses them and then provides Zoloft as a prescription. Well, there's going to be some psychiatrists who are going to be using Zoloft to address depression, some who are going to be using it to address anxiety, some who are going to be using it to address both. Now, if the psychiatrist, in addition to providing that prescription, also provides a diagnosis, then I already know what the mindset is just by the label that the psychiatrist provided. So I don't automatically say, oh, well, Zoloft's an antidepressant. This person must be depressed. Um, I can gather more information very quickly from having that diagnosis. Now, where do these diagnoses come from? Well, they come from this book, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition. Boom. The DSM-5. It's a fat book. It is 1,000 pages? No, 947 pages long. It's a big old book. There's a whole lot of stuff in here. And this is where mental health diagnoses come from, at least in 2020 in the United States. This is where we get it from. This is the book that spells out all of them. And when I say that there's a wide range of stuff in here, there's a wide range of stuff in here. And what I want to do is I want to look at two particular diagnoses. The first one, I want you to listen to the symptoms, the cluster that make up the label, and I want you to try to guess what the label is. So let me turn to it. In the different diagnostic criteria, there are often different sections. And you'll have to say, okay, there's one from column A, two from column B, that type of thing. So here's the diagnostic criteria. There are four criteria, four basic areas that need to have occurred in order for this person to have this particular diagnosis. Okay, so number one, the first one is recent ingestion of alcohol. So in order for this person to have the diagnosis, they must have a recent ingestion of alcohol. Number two, they must have clinically significant problematic behavior or psychological changes. And then they give some examples. Inappropriate sexual or aggressive behavior, mood liability, that means mood going all over the place, or impaired judgment. And these changes, these problematic behavioral or psychological changes, must have developed during or shortly after the alcohol's ingestion. So you've got to have those two things. You've got to ingest the alcohol, and there's got to be behavior or psychological changes that are clinically significant. Number three, this person must also have one or more of the following signs developing during or shortly after alcohol use. Number one, slurred speech. Number two, incoordination. Three, unsteady gait. Uh-oh. Number four, I was supposed to look up how to pronounce this before I did this video, and I didn't do it. All right, it's Nystagmus. I don't forgot what it means too. Um, Nystagmus. I'm gonna have to find out what that means. Put it down in the section below. Number five, impairment in attention or memory. And number six is a stupor or a coma. So in addition to recent ingestion of alcohol and some type of clinical a clinically significant behavioral change or psychological change. They also must have slurred speech, incoordination, unsteady gait, that word I can't pronounce, impairment in attention or memory, or stupor or coma, one or more of those. And then the final category is signs and symptoms cannot be attributable to some other type of medical condition or not better explained by some other mental health disorder, including intoxication of some other substance other than alcohol. So I've read through the diagnosis here, how one would go about finding the appropriate label for somebody in this condition. What do you think the diagnosis is? Do, 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 do. All right, time's up. All right, so this is the diagnosis for alcohol intoxication. Chances are you got it right. They actually have a diagnosis for being drunk. And that's part of my point. When we talk about mental health diagnosis and the stigma that's associated with it, and what are they? Why are they labeling people this way? Part of the thing that we got to remember is that not everything in this book is like what you typically think of when you think of as a mental health diagnosis. Some of this is just a description, a label of what's going on with a person in life. And so if somebody comes to my office and they're intoxicated, when I explain to the insurance company why I didn't do an assessment, this is the diagnosis that I might be giving them. I wasn't able to do the assessment. The person wasn't intoxicated. And an insurance company looking at the billing will see, oh, okay, I see the diagnosis code. It's a F10. Um, let's see, F10.129, I believe. The yeah, if it's mild, F1010, moderate F1020, and it's severe F1020. If they see those codes there, they're gonna know right away, oh, she didn't finish the assessment because the person was drunk. But can you see kind of how that works? So we want to kind of demystify what's happening when there is a diagnosis. So let's go through something that maybe is a more common diagnosis, something that um, um, happens more frequently and that you might be more familiar with when it comes to the thought of going to see counseling. I want to run through a little bit more complicated of a diagnosis, but that's the diagnosis for major depressive disorder. So if somebody was coming into my office and they struggled with their mood, one of the things that I would do was consider the possibility that they are experiencing one of the very many different types of mood disorders that is described in this here DSM-5. And each one of them has its own set of diagnoses. We're only going to look at one of them today, but these are the types of things that the counselor would be asking questions to kind of make a determination relative to diagnosis. So here we're going to look at major depressive disorder. So we'll notice that it's a depressive disorder, not an anxiety disorder or some other type of disorder. And it's a major depressive disorder as opposed to a minor depressive disorder. And once again, we have five main categories that need to be met in order to call things major depressive disorder. So here's category one. In category one, there must be five or more of the following symptoms, and at least one of them needs to be symptom number one or symptom number two, and it needs to last for at least 2 weeks. So that all 5 of these, 5 or more, need to be present in the same 2 week period. And it needs to represent a change in functioning from what was functioning previously. All right. So what are those categories? We've got 9 symptoms, and a person would need to have at least 5 during the past 2 weeks in order for this to be possibly major depressive disorder. Okay. The first one is depressed mood. Most of the day, nearly every day, as indicated either by subjective report, they feel sad, empty, hopeless, or by the observations of others. Other person says, oh, they're always tearful. Um, and then particularly in children and adolescents, it may manifest as an irritable mood. Number two, a marked diminished interest or pleasure in all or almost all activities most of the day, nearly every day. So you see how it's not just, somebody felt sad for a day or two. It needs to be almost all of these 2 weeks. And one of those first two that we've just listed, must be present in order to call it major depressive disorder. Another possible symptom is significant weight loss, and they define what significant weight loss or weight gain, either way, as 5% of body weight change in a month. And they make a note, might be different for children, um, and and that's important. But these are really written for adults. Four is insomnia or hypersomnia, so not being able to sleep or sleeping way too much. Um, Number 5 is psychomotor agitation. That's kind of big, jumpy, or jittery, or psychomotor retardation, kind of really slow motion kind of movements. Hey, we need to get ready to go, and they're kind of just really, really noticeably slow. Number 6, fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day. Number 7, feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt. And it may even be delusional type of guilt, and that needs to be present nearly every day over this 2 week period. Um, Number 8, inability to think straight, to concentrate, indecisiveness, again, nearly every day. And number 9, recurrent thoughts about death. Not necessarily a fear of dying, that might be something else, but rather a recurrent suicidal ideation, perhaps without a specific plan, perhaps with a specific plan, or a suicide attempt. So someone must have at least 5 of these 9, including one of the first two that we mentioned, the sad mood or the markedly diminished interest in doing activities, in order for this to be major depressive disorder. The next category is that these symptoms must cause clinically significant distress or impairment, socially, occupationally, or in other important areas of functioning. So if the person has all these symptoms, but it's really not bothering them, we don't call it major depressive disorder. Maybe they're just going through a hard time. It's not a clinically significant diagnosis, at least not here. You can find it one of those other 20 or so mood disorders that we discussed. Part C. The episode is not attributable to the physiological effects of a substance or some other medical condition. Right? So this is the reason why when somebody comes to my office for the first time and they present with depression, and I'm seeing these types of symptoms, one of the first things I do is if they haven't already been to their primary care physician, I send them to the primary care physician. Why? Because there are medical problems that can look like depression. Now, why am I using counseling when you just need some vitamin D? or why am I doing counseling when you need to have your thyroid checked? Like that's sometimes it's a medical issue, and we need to send folks to the medical doctor. And so that's what they're saying here. Don't call it major depressive disorder if it can be explained by some type of medical condition or some type of substance. I mean, if the person is taking some type of depressant medication and abusing it, they have depression symptoms. That's not major depressive disorder. That's a substance use abuse type of disorder. All right. Um, They also make note that in life we have challenges from time to time. We have various losses. It can be the loss of a loved one. It can be financial losses, significant financial losses. And they make note that we should be careful when we attribute a diagnosis like major depressive disorder when those types of situations have come up. We might actually be looking at more of what's called an adjustment disorder than a depression. And so it is important to kind of tease that out. Um, Part D, the occurrence of the major depressive episode is not better explained by some other disorder. There are a variety of other disorders, particularly in the psychotic family, that have an element of them that look like mood disorders. So schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, schizophreniform, the delusional disorders, they might have an element of them that looks like depression. So now you're starting to see why they require a master's degree before they let you do this, because now you can't just say, well, I'm going to um, uh, specifically work with depressed clients. You've got to also know the difference between depression and the psychotic disorders. So that's part of the reason why so much education is required before states would license folks to be able to present these diagnoses. And then the fifth category, E, is that there has never been a manic episode or a hypomanic episode. This one is really tricky because that's referring to folks who are not experiencing major depressive disorder, but instead are really experiencing bipolar disorder. And the interesting thing about bipolar is very often when the person is experiencing that manic episode or hypomanic episode, they're not coming to a counselor. They're coming when they're depressed. And so the person who is doing a correct diagnosis of major depressive disorder has to also make sure that they ask the questions that are appropriate to rule out bipolar disorder. So do you see how it gets real complicated real quick? We just dealt with a pretty straightforward kind of diagnosis. It's and we didn't even get into the modifiers that help us to more finely tune the diagnosis. We just did kind of a basic overview. And so you can see how complicated it can be to come up with a diagnosis, which is why when you go to the counselor for the first time, they're asking you a lot of questions. They very often have had you to fill out a lot of paperwork ahead of time. The reason why is they want to be very careful when making the diagnosis. Now, I said before that sometimes these diagnoses will be made and sometimes they will not. What's the cutoff? Well, in general, if you are going to see a licensed counselor, a marriage and family therapist, a licensed clinical social worker, chances are that very first time that you meet, they are going to create for you a diagnosis, even if it's a provisional one, even if they weren't able to get enough information in order to firm it up, chances are That's their goal within the first session. I don't want you to be afraid of that goal because, like we said before, it's a label. There's a wide range of labels in the book. And so it's not like you're getting a label that says that something is terribly wrong with you per se, because as we saw before, there's a label for intoxication, just plain old alcohol intoxication. And so we don't want you to be afraid of that label, but do be aware that if you are seeing someone is licensed, chances are they're going to give you a diagnosis. If you are seeing someone and your insurance company is paying for it, they're going to want a diagnosis. They want to make sure that they are paying for mental health problems as defined by the DSM-5 and not for family conflict, not for marriage counseling, not because you have a spiritual question. That's not what insurance is designed to pay for. And so insurance companies, as part of their billing process, they want to know two things. They want, well, more than two. They want to know who saw you. Was it a counselor, a social worker? Was it a psychologist? Was it a psychiatrist? That's what they want to know. They want to know what type of service was provided. Was it an assessment or treatment planning? Was it individual counseling, group counseling, or family counseling? And then they want to know also, what are you treating? What is the diagnosis? What are you saying is wrong with this person that is necessary to um, they need, that there's a medical need for this particular service. Now, I just said something that may have pricked your ear, and that is what's wrong with the person. And that is part of the struggle with this whole process of presenting folks with a diagnosis. It suggests that there is something wrong with the person. And that's where I really struggle, and I'm sure others as well struggle with these labels because they, by that definition, suggest that there's something wrong with the person, that what they are experiencing is abnormal. And I think that that's part of, it's not the whole, it's not all of why many biblical counselors do not use diagnosis, but a part of it is just that it provides a label, and that label can be used as an excuse. So, I'm not doing what I'm supposed to do because I struggle with major depressive disorder. Yeah, maybe you just need to do what you're supposed to do and supposed to do it. Like, like maybe the diagnosis doesn't prevent you from doing what God has asked us to do, right? And I think that the biblical counselors do very good point. We've seen this play out a lot with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. Right? We say that someone has this diagnosis and then excuse them from obeying their parents. Well, the Word of God doesn't say, obey your parents unless you have a particular condition, in which case you're excused from obeying your parents. That's not what the Word says. And so there is this tendency towards, well, gee, if the person has a mental health diagnosis, maybe they can't help themselves, and therefore we have to excuse their behavior. And I would suggest that that is a misuse of diagnosis. Another place that we see diagnoses misused is in the courtroom. A lot of times, whether it's technically in the courtroom or it is a government agency that's trying to make an adjudication regarding whether or not somebody should get a particular service, get disability. There's too much emphasis placed on what is the diagnosis, when the diagnosis really wasn't designed to excuse behavior, or identify who can and who cannot work, or who can and who cannot manage a certain level of responsibility. Now, let me give you an example of that. Many, many years ago, I worked with a, a young woman who had a, a position very high in government, where she had some very serious responsibilities. Um, Responsibilities that, if she messed it up, could impact national security. And she also had a bipolar diagnosis. And, I would say it was every 6 months to a year, I would get contacted by the CIA, who wanted to make sure that she was still receiving services and that she was still okay for doing her position. And and that was in part because, whoa, she's got this bipolar diagnosis. We know what bipolar is. And and it turns out that she is one of the most responsible women I've ever met. But the concern was that she would be irresponsible because she had this particular diagnosis. And so I can appreciate that, particularly when it comes to national security, you want to be sure, right? I can appreciate why the diagnosis was concerning to the powers that be. I can appreciate that. Why they wanted to make sure that this particular person was doing what she needed to do in order to stay healthy. And I can also appreciate why folks don't want to get a diagnosis in the first place. Because, yeah, if you have a top level security clearance, it could be an issue. While our records are often kept confidential, there are certain situations in which we have to give those records up. Um, and so you may want to keep that in mind. If you do not want to have a diagnosis for some reason, you're not going to be using your health insurance to pay for counseling services. And that may be okay, because very often you can find within the world of biblical counseling that's not going to necessarily give you a diagnosis. Very often you can find folks that will have either a sliding scale, or in some cases, because the church is paying the salary of the counselor, you might be able to find free counseling with some of the biblical counselors. So, if, don't let the fear of the diagnosis keep you from getting help. And that really is my point. That's part of the reason why we went through the diagnoses in the DSM-5. I would encourage folks to not be afraid of the diagnoses. And if you have really good reason to say, you know what, I don't want somebody to give me a diagnosis, that does not mean that help is not available. It just means that you need to be careful when you go about the process of getting counseling, to identify who it is who might be able to work with you and not provide that documented diagnosis. Well, this has been one of our longer talks. It is something that I'm passionate about, because I do believe that the labels are both helpful and overused and misused. And so it's just kind of one of those issues that's kind of dear to me. um, I hope that this has been helpful to you, though, in thinking through the use of diagnoses. And I would encourage you, if you have questions about diagnoses, if I can, just put them in the comment section, and if it's something that I feel like I can provide them help with, I will follow up. and respond to those questions in a Ask Cindy. You can also reach me for Ask Cindy questions by emailing me at Cindy, CYNDY, at getoutofthewoods.com. Be sure to like the video if you did indeed like it. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already so that you can know more about how to live a life that is both Christ-centered and emotionally healthy. Well, the time has come once again for us to get off of YouTube and to get into God's Word. God bless you.